The last couple of weeks, we've been in a brief series called Unexpected Turns in the Road of Life. And a couple of weeks ago, we were in Genesis 22, looking at Abraham and Isaac. Last week, we were in Genesis 32, looking at Jacob. And today we'll be in Genesis 42, and we're going to look at Jacob and Joseph, and we'll go back to Abraham, and we'll see if we can't tie all of these guys together. But turn with me to Genesis 42, and let's just look at one verse to start with. Genesis 42, verse 36. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me." Several years ago, Pam and I went on a date, and we went to see a movie called Simon Birch. Anybody remember Simon Birch? It's this movie about this little boy. He was born extremely tiny, and it turns out he was a midget. Yet he was small in stature, but he was ginormous in personality. And as this little kid grows up, he just knows that God has a purpose for his life, and he's going to be a hero, and God's going to use him. And yet, as his story unfolds, it's just one bad thing after the other happens in this poor kid's life. And as the movie goes along, you have all this hope for Simon, and yet you realize, yeah, probably never going to happen for you, buddy. Your life is just a disaster, really. And as you come to the end of the movie, he's on this school bus that's coming home from a camp, and there's a bus accident. The bus goes off the road, down a hill, and runs into a lake, and all of these little kids are on the bus. And it turns out that Simon is the one person that can save them. And because of his size, he ends up getting all of those kids off the bus, swimming out and swimming back, and he saves the day. But he ends up getting sick as a result and ends up dying in the hospital. And as it came to the end of that movie, I was so moved by what was happening, by this poor kid Simon, who it just seemed like his life has no purpose at all. And then you realize at the end of the movie, everything comes together. And there's a reason all of this has happened. And Simon, you do have a purpose. And I mean, I got so choked up watching this movie, and suddenly I realized, this is a movie. I'm in a theater. What am I doing? But I couldn't hold it back. I mean, I was just going to burst out crying, and I had to get up and run out of the theater. And there are people standing in the hallway, so I darted into a bathroom. And then there was a guy standing at the urinal, so I went into a stall and closed the door, and I just said, I couldn't hold it in. And then I couldn't leave the stall until that guy left the bathroom because I was so embarrassed, And then I made my way back in and sat down next to Pam, and we finished the movie. And in Genesis chapter 42, Jacob finds himself in a position, I think, much like old Simon Birch. I mean, his whole life just seems to have fallen apart. And in order to understand what's going on, though, you have to go back a few years. As a matter of fact, you have to go back a few generations. You have to go all the way back to Abraham's grandfather, a guy by the name of Abraham. Abraham had been given a promise by God that he was going to have a son. But that promise didn't seem to come to pass. And he and his wife had been waiting for years, but she couldn't get pregnant, and they never had this baby. And finally, Sarah says to Abraham, it's not going to happen. I can't have a baby. So why don't you take my handmaiden, Hagar, and have sexual relations with her and have a baby through her, and we'll just count that child as ours. And Abraham says, well, Sarah, okay. And so he takes Sarah's servant, and he has sexual relations with her, and she ends up getting pregnant, and they have a baby. And they name that baby Ishmael. And things go along okay for several years. But then eventually, miracle of miracles, Sarah gets pregnant and at 90, and she ends up having a baby. And they name that baby Isaac, because when God said that they were going to have this child, Sarah laughed. And the name Isaac means laughter, because God says, well, when you have the baby, you name him Isaac, and we'll see who gets the last laugh. Well, sure enough, now they have this baby Isaac. And as the boys grow up, Ishmael is considerably older than Isaac. And when Ishmael is a teenager, he starts making fun of his little brother. He's picking on him. And Sarah becomes a mama bear. I mean, she's not going to tolerate this. And so she tells Abraham, you need to send Hagar and Ishmael away. They cannot live with us any longer. And Abraham doesn't really want to do that. And he's praying about it. And God speaks to Abraham again. And God says to Abraham, Abraham, listen to your wife. And that might be a word for some guys right now. You may need to take that verse and memorize it yourself, because you may not be listening to your wife when she has some exceptionally wonderful advice to give. Abraham wasn't so sure, but he said, okay, Lord, and he sends them away. And Ishmael and Hagar, that whole relationship was a disaster for Abraham and Sarah, and becomes a problem. And the reason is because it should have never happened to begin with. Abraham should have never slept with Sarah's handmaiden. He should have never had this son. They didn't trust God. They didn't believe what God said. They thought, well, we'll just have to take care of this ourselves. It was a great blunder in Abraham's life. And Ishmael ends up becoming the father of the Arab nations. And Isaac ends up becoming the father of Jacob, who becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And to this day, the Arab nations and the nation of Israel are continuing to live in conflict. The problems that go on throughout history and throughout our world today continue to go back to Abraham's two sons because of a decision that Abraham made that he should have never made to begin with. Well, besides that point, the years go by, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons. And those 12 sons become jealous of their brother Joseph. Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite son. He's the son of the wife that he loves, Rachel. And because of his love for this son, the other brothers are always jealous of Joseph. Until one day, Joseph comes out to the field where the other brothers are to check on him, and they decide, we've had enough of this guy. We got to get rid of him. And so they grab Joseph and they throw him in a pit, into a dry well. And he's down there at the bottom of the pit. He hears them talking up above, and they say, let's just kill him and be done with him once and for all. They all agree, that's what we should do, just kill him. And as they're talking about doing that, suddenly they see a caravan coming their way of traders that are going down to Egypt to trade goods. And they decide, instead of just killing him, we could make some money off of this guy. Why don't we just sell him to this caravan and let them take him down to Egypt and be done with him? And so that's what they do. They end up, instead of killing him, they sell him to this caravan of traders. And Joseph is taken away down to Egypt as a slave. You know his story. Once he gets down there, he's sold to a guy by the name of Potiphar, and he becomes a servant in Potiphar's household. Things go well for Joseph there in Potiphar's house for a while, until Potiphar's wife starts coming on to Joseph, and he resists her advances. She becomes angry about that. She tells Potiphar that Joseph tried to rape her, and Joseph is thrown in prison. While he's in prison, things go pretty well for Joseph. I mean, he advances into prison. But to make a long story short, Pharaoh himself, the head of the nation, has a dream, and Joseph ends up interpreting that dream, and Joseph is lifted up out of the prison and ends up becoming the prime minister of Egypt by the time the story wraps up. And there's a famine coming on the land, and Joseph has developed a plan to store grain, to be prepared for this famine that comes. Well, the famine does come, and Joseph's brothers and his father are still living up north and in Canaan, and they're getting hungry, and this drought and this famine is setting in. And so Jacob sends his sons down to Egypt to see if they can't find food down there, get some grain and bring back, or we're going to die up here. And so the brothers all go down to Egypt, and they end up standing before the prime minister to ask for grain in this program that he has to feed people who are struggling during this difficult time. And they don't realize that the guy they're standing before here in all this Egyptian regalia is their brother Joseph. And Joseph asks them who they are. They tell them, well, we're just brothers. You know, there are 12 of us. One has died, and we have a younger brother who's back home with our father. And he says, no, you're spies. That's who you are. And so he takes one of the brothers, Simeon, and locks him up. And he gives the other brothers the grain that they're asking for, but then he says, to prove who you say you are, you come back and bring your younger brother if you have a younger brother, and then I'll let this brother in prison go free. And so they head back to Canaan to their father. And when they get there, they tell Jacob what has happened, that he's kept Simeon, and he wants us to take Benjamin down to prove who we really are because he thinks we're spies. And that is when Jacob says, Joseph is no more. And Simeon is no more. He's locked up in that prison. He thinks he's probably going to be killed down there too. And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me, he says. Everything is against me. Oh, Jacob, if you only knew. Jacob has no idea what's going on. He thinks Joseph has died, but Joseph isn't dead. Joseph is alive and well. He's the prime minister. He just doesn't know it yet. Simeon's going to be fine. Benjamin is going to be fine. Jacob doesn't see it. In his mind, from his perspective, it looks like at this moment, everything is against him. Little does he know, actually, everything is working together for him. But that's the way life is sometimes. Sometimes it looks like everything is against you, when really, you just don't see the big picture yet. Right now, we're living through this pandemic, and it may look to you like, man, everything is against me. Maybe you're dealing with this coronavirus in some way in your family personally. Or maybe it's just the economy. Maybe your job has been affected as a result of this. And things just, you can't figure out how is this going to work out? I mean, this is a disaster. Things are a mess right now. And I don't see how things are going to turn around. Even when they open things back up, you know, this virus is probably just going to spike back up again. Or if we don't open up sometime soon, our whole economy is going to collapse, or my job isn't going to be available. I look at the circumstances around me right now, and I see our politicians who can't agree when things are at their best, and right now are completely divided about the way things should be handled, just like much of our nation is. And I think, wow, I mean, everything is divided and difficult and working against us. But you know, maybe not. Maybe not. Just when Jacob thought everything is working against me, it turned out in reality, although he could not see it yet, everything was working together for him. The Bible says in Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. We have this promise from God. He's going to work everything together for good. And yet, we can find ourselves like Jacob, not really understanding how God's going to work everything together. We can be like Abraham and start to not trust God's promise and think, it's just not going to work out. Wait a minute. If God has given us a promise, we can trust his promise. And he has promised he's working all things together for good. And in a time like this, what we need to do is hold on to the promises that God has given us. You know, back in the early 1900s, around 1915, there was a problem agriculturally in our country with a thing called the boll weevil. It was a little beetle that had come up from Mexico, but it was absolutely obliterating the cotton crops in our country. And in Coffee County, Alabama, the farmers in Coffee County realized that they had a massive problem on their hands because their crops were absolutely destroyed by the boll weevil. And they didn't know what in the world to do. And in the town of Enterprise, the farmers in that town all got together at the local church for a prayer meeting. And they were praying, God, we need help. We need direction. We need to know how to get through this. We need you to help our crops to grow and not be destroyed. Everything is falling apart economically and agriculturally. And they were crying out to God for help. And And they were holding on to this verse, Romans 8:28. All things work together for good. God, we need you somehow to work this together for us. And after that prayer meeting, the farmers decided they needed to change their crops. Instead of planting cotton, let's start planting peanuts, which was an odd choice because peanuts were not in high demand in that day. And yet, that's what they chose to do. At that same time, there was a guy by the name of George who had been praying too. George was a brilliant man, and he was praying himself, and he had prayed, God, show me the secrets of the universe. And then he thought, it's probably a bit much to ask. As a matter of fact, he says he felt like God said to him, little man, you're too small for me to give you the secrets of my universe. But I will give you the secrets to the peanut. And sure enough, George Washington Carver, began studying the peanut. And God indeed revealed to him the secrets of the peanut. He ended up developing over 300 products from the peanut. He developed foods and shampoos and shoe polish and soaps and plastics. I mean, over 300 products he developed from the peanut. And suddenly the peanut became in high demand. It became a boom crop. People needed peanuts. And in Coffee County, Alabama, they just happened to have crops and crops and crops of peanuts. And it turned the entire economy of that county around. And as a matter of fact, they ended up placing a statue in the center of town in Enterprise, Alabama. It's a statue of this woman, a massive statue of this woman, and she's holding up over her head a bowl. And inside the bowl is this massive little beetle, this boll weevil. And at the bottom of that statue is an inscription. And the inscription reads, "In profound appreciation of the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity, this monument was erected by the citizens of Enterprise, Coffee County, Alabama." The boll weevil. Romans 8:28, they said, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. This cotton being destroyed by the boll weevil, it turns out that is the thing that turned our economy around. Once we stopped planting cotton and we started planting peanuts, everything boomed for Enterprise, Alabama, there in Coffee County. The boll weevil, the herald of prosperity, who would have thought it at the time? And so too in our day. We have this virus going around, and right now we think, wow, this is just a disaster. But you never know. This may be the herald of prosperity in a way that we would have never dreamed in this moment, in this day. But we hold on to the promise of God, because God can turn everything around, just like he did for the citizens of Coffee County, Alabama. Just like he's going to do for Jacob in this passage. Yeah, but what if the problem isn't just something outside of me? You know, what if it's not a boll weevil that's destroyed our crops, or a virus that's come in, or something that someone else has done? What if the reason I'm struggling is because of decisions of my own making? I've done something really stupid, and that's why I'm in this mess. Can that ever be turned around? Oh, come on. Listen. Let me give you a fascinating tale. In Genesis 37, when Joseph was sold as a slave by his brothers, they wanted to kill him. They were about to kill him. And then a caravan of traders came by, and they saw that caravan, and they said, hey, let's stop. Let's not kill him. Let's sell him so we can make a profit off of him. Awful decision, terrible thing for them to do. But let me back up from there. Years earlier, Abraham decided to do something he should not have done. He slept with Hagar, the handmaiden, and they had a son. And they named that son Ishmael. But if you advance from that story all the way to Genesis chapter 37, and you see Joseph in that pit, and his brothers about to kill him until they see the caravan coming, and they say, wow, let's trade him. Let's sell him to this caravan. The scripture tells us that the people in that caravan were Check this out. Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael. If Abraham had not slept with Hagar, made that blunder of a decision, if he hadn't done the wrong thing, all these years later, as Joseph is in this pit, his brothers were about to kill him, but this caravan comes by and they sell him to the caravan, and the caravan are Ishmaelites. If it weren't for those Ishmaelites coming by when they did, and buying Joseph as a slave and taking him to Egypt and selling him to Potiphar, Joseph would have never ended up in that prison and would have never been elevated to prime minister and would have never developed a plan for preparing for this famine. And when his brothers were dying out in the desert and came to Egypt for help, they would have never been saved. But they were saved because all those years earlier, Abraham made that dumb decision. Listen to me. God can take your biggest blunders and use them to create his greatest wonders. Maybe you've made a terrible blunder. Maybe you've gone through some awful thing. Maybe it's your own fault. But God can take your biggest blunders and use them to create some of his greatest wonders. He can do that with you. Even if it's some stupid decision you've made, even if it's something that's going on in this world that's out of your control and out of your hands, all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. What he did for Joseph and Jacob and Abraham, what he did for the people of Enterprise, Alabama, God will be faithful to do for you. He is true to his word, even when you can't quite figure out how. Maybe you feel fickle about all that. Maybe sometimes your faith is strong and sometimes your faith is kind of weak, and sometimes I believe it'll work out, and sometimes you think, I don't see how this can ever happen. Well, let me tell you, there was a missionary by the name of David Livingstone, and he, of course, is legendary. I bet if you don't even know the stories of David Livingstone, you probably still know his name. David Livingstone was a missionary in Africa, legendary man. But after he died, several years later, another missionary from Scotland made his way to Central Africa, a guy by the name of Daniel Crawford. But Daniel Crawford was kind of following in the footsteps of David Livingstone. And there were a lot of people who wondered if he really had what it took to follow in Livingstone's footsteps. David Livingstone was such a dynamic powerhouse of a personality. And even the people at his own church back in Scotland weren't sure that Daniel Crawford was really up for the task. He doubted he was himself at times. But off he went to Africa. And in Central Africa there, he ministered. And the fact is, over time, he learned how to communicate with those people so effectively. He learned to use the surroundings and the stories of their culture to share the gospel with those people. And he had an extremely effective ministry for the 22 years that he ministered there in Africa. And when he died, they found a poem that he had written on the inside cover of his Bible. Daniel Crawford had written, "I cannot do it alone. The waves dash fast and high. The fog comes chilling around and the light goes out in the sky. But I know that we too shall win in the end, Jesus and I. Coward and wayward and weak, I change with the changing sky. Today so strong and brave, tomorrow too weak to fly. But he never gives in, so we too shall win, Jesus and I." Maybe you find yourself feeling like, man, I don't know what to do in the midst of this mess with everything going on right now. You hold on to the promises of God. That's what you and I do. You may not be able to do it on your own. You don't have to. But you can do it with Jesus. He walks with you. He's given promises to you. And he will see you through. All things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose.